Yep, just like the old days. Last year, there were some pretty big breakthroughs for PS1 emulation on the Wii. An emulator called Wii SX had a surprise update released on April 29th, 2023. But before this, the last update posted was from 2016, 13 years prior. This update dramatically improved performance for PS1 emulation on Nintendo system with a new dynamic recompiler called LightRec. And while that's great and all for the Wii, this update also applied to their other PlayStation 1 emulator called Cube SX that's designed for the GameCube. So today, I'm going to show you the incredible progress that's been made by the homebrew community, bringing playable PS1 games to Nintendo's 6th generation console. I know PS1 emulation has pretty much been conquered online to the point that games are getting all sorts of enhancements applied with new textures, higher frame rates, and 4K. However, something like a GameCube running these games is more about the idea of it just being possible. For the PS2 to get PS1 games working when it released, Sony had to do a lot with the hardware alongside of the software. For example, the original PlayStation CPU is actually present on most PS2 motherboards and will handle I/O functions for PlayStation 2 games and will kick into PS1 CPU mode when called for backwards compatibility. Basically, even Sony wasn't accomplishing this with full software early on, at least not until late slim PS2 systems from what I understand. When you compare the system specs at the time, the GameCube fit nicely in the middle, at least on paper, stronger than the PS2, but weaker than the Xbox. The original Xbox console is supported heavily in the homebrew community, with PS1 emulation already working really well for years now. This is mainly due to the fact that Microsoft used off-the-shelf parts and turned in a very capable machine, especially with its CPU and RAM. It really was an impressive machine at the time, and I think is well worth picking up today to see everything the community has been able to squeeze out of this now 23-year-old system. I've done a few videos on modifying and trying out homebrew on the Xbox, and if you're curious to see more, I'll link it down below in the description. The GameCube, unfortunately, has seen a rockier road to PS1 emulation, with a handful of emulators available running games at frame rates in the teens if you're lucky. Basically, it's been an unplayable mess, and with the Wii just being a better equipped GameCube, at this point, it's no wonder that there really hasn't been much interest in development for the past several years. But now with this newly updated Cube SX released, I was looking to load up some PS1 ISO files and see what this little purple box could really do. Except there was just one problem. In order to load games last year, you needed to use the SD to memory card adapter, which I really don't keep around much after the advent of the SD to SP2. It's a little adapter that turns one of the bottom serial ports into an SD slot compatible with microSD cards. This combined with Swiss is the ultimate combo, and it's used by, I would say, the majority of people with a modded GameCube at this point. Unfortunately, Cube SX didn't support this adapter, but they mentioned it would be added later, so I put the whole thing on the back burner until now because with an update, they have indeed added support. It looks like along the way they've managed to improve performance even further and smoothed out other things like disk swapping. So I downloaded the latest Cube SX DOL file, PS1 BIOS, some ISOs, moved it all over to the SD card, and fired up Swiss. Once loaded into Cube SX, you'll see a pretty simple menu to explore with Load ISO, Current ISO, Settings, Credits, Quit, and Resume Game. Poking around in the settings, there really isn't too much to adjust here. You want to keep the CPU core on Dynarec, and if you have a PS1 BIOS on your SD card, you can load it here. Pressing Execute BIOS will actually throw you into the PS1 menu, which is a weird thing to see live loading on that GameCube. For video, I have my settings here that I found work the best for me. I have Show FPS toggled to on, so you can get an idea how these games are running throughout this video. There are also options for mapping your controller out, and this becomes a bit of an issue since the stock GameCube controller doesn't have enough buttons to cover everything on that PS2 controller. Seems like a good time for someone to come up with GameCube to PS2 controller adapters and start mass marketing to the dozens of us out there who would actually use them here. Okay, on to the game, starting with one that was actually one of the harder titles to run, and that's Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2. Classic game, of course, but I figured the speed and fluid motion this game has would be a good indication for input and movement overall, and right away, I was able to notice some stuttering happening, especially with the audio. Pro Skater 2 ran at 30 FPS on the PS1 and Nintendo 64 originally. It's certainly playable, but can be a bit annoying with some of the random stutters when trying to balance on rails or pull off specials in the air. I mean, I pretty much had to. Square left Nintendo for Sony during the previous generation to develop Final Fantasy VII, and the rest is history, with Sony going on to take over the home console market. I had to give Nintendo the alternate timeline here, where they went with discs for the N64, and this would be a backwards compatible game for the GameCube. It runs well here too, at least, touching 60 FPS pretty consistently outside of battles, with drops mostly coming from rendering the more detailed characters during fights. Even the spells like lightning look normal here, no signs of weird graphical glitches that you can run into with emulation on lower end hardware. It even formatted my memory card for me and saved the game, so that's a plus. Gran Turismo is next, a bit more of the heavy 3D type game for the PS1, and it holds up pretty well. It does fluctuate quite a bit here, jumping around in the high 40s to high 50s depending on how many cars are on the screen at once. The original ran at 30 FPS like many PS1 games, so if that 60 FPS lock is too much, I'd prefer just to stick as close as possible to the original experience here. I did notice a bit of input delay, especially around sharp corners. Not sure if that was due to some of the frame timing that was jumping around or just input delay that needs to be worked out. Otherwise, no crashes. Well, okay, other than the ones that I caused, of course. Mega Man Legends ran well, but I did have an issue where I wasn't able to lock onto enemies since you need to use R2, and that wasn't available by default. I'd be able to go in and set this in the controls menu, but this just brings up the issues around the lack of buttons on that GameCube controller, even compared to the original PS1 controller. There was a similar situation with Metal Gear Solid, which also ran well, by the way, but I couldn't pick up the codec call when approaching the elevator because there's no select button. For Twin Snakes, it was mapped to a combination of two buttons, so maybe that would be a good way to get around this in some cases. The last update for Cube SX was posted just over a year ago in November 2023, and at this point the emulator is in a really good spot, with many of these games running well above 30 FPS through purely software emulation. There are still refinements for each title, sure, since it isn't perfect, but I am really impressed by what a community of talented developers were able to pull off on a system that really has no business running these games this well. With that said, would I recommend people use the GameCube as a primary way to emulate PS1 games? Absolutely not. There are a bunch of devices you can buy for way cheaper than the GameCube to emulate PS1 games, or even by using a device you already own like the PC or phone you're watching this video on right now. Get the GameCube with Swiss and the SD2 SP2 to play GameCube games. But if you already have one or are curious to see how different PS1 games you like to play run on your GameCube, try it out and see for yourself. I'll leave a link to the GitHub page that has the emulator below in the description. Make sure you follow the instructions they've laid out, especially with the file path structure on the SD card, and you'll be up and running in just a few minutes. Anyway, that's it for this video. Let me know what you think about the PS1 games running like this on the GameCube, and I'll see you next time.